My name is Edmund Hale. I am a chronicler of markets, and this channel documents decisions made under pressure, the quiet moments before mistakes become visible and patterns repeat themselves across generations. I do not record profits, I record behavior. History changes, but people do not. In 1982, Ray Dalio was certain the global economy was about to collapse. Inflation had shaken the world, interest rates were rising, and debt was tightening across governments and companies. To Dalio, the pattern seemed clear. The system was under pressure, and pressure in markets rarely disappears quietly. He studied the data carefully and reached a conclusion that felt inevitable. A depression was coming. Dalio did not keep the prediction private. He explained it to clients, to banks, and to anyone willing to listen, convinced that the global economy was approaching a breaking point. But the market did something he did not expect. Instead of collapsing, it rose. Not slowly and not cautiously, it surged. Stocks climbed higher, confidence returned, and investors began celebrating what looked like the beginning of a new expansion. Suddenly, the man who had warned about collapse looked completely wrong. Money began disappearing from his fund. Clients questioned his judgment. Some demanded their capital back, and others simply stopped returning his calls. Within months, the company he had built was falling apart. Ray Dalio had to fire nearly everyone. The office grew quiet. The desks were empty, and the future of his firm depended on a loan from his father. Years later, Bridgewater would become the largest hedge fund in the world. But that story did not begin with success. It began with a mistake, and with a man forced to understand why he had been so certain. At the beginning of the 1980s, the global economy was still recovering from a decade of instability. Inflation had surged across the United States. Interest rates had climbed to levels few had seen before, and policymakers were struggling to control the damage left by years of monetary expansion. For many investors, the environment felt uncertain but manageable. Markets had endured difficult periods before, and confidence in long-term growth had not disappeared. Ray Dalio saw the situation differently. He had spent years studying the relationship between debt, interest rates, and economic cycles. To him, the patterns emerging in the data did not resemble a temporary slowdown. They looked like the early stages of a deeper contraction. Rising interest rates were putting pressure on borrowers. Governments carried large amounts of debt, companies depended heavily on credit, and the cost of financing that debt was increasing rapidly. Dalio believed the system had reached a fragile point. If interest rates remained high, the pressure on borrowers would intensify. If governments tightened policy too aggressively, economic activity could slow dramatically. In his analysis, the outcome seemed almost inevitable. The global economy, he believed, was approaching a severe downturn. This conclusion did not come from intuition or speculation. It came from models, historical comparisons, and a deep conviction that economic cycles followed patterns repeating throughout history. Dalio had built his investment philosophy on that belief. Patterns mattered. History mattered. And if the pattern he was seeing was correct, the market was dangerously optimistic. So he acted on his conviction. He positioned his fund for a collapse that he believed was already forming beneath the surface of the economy. For a moment, the logic felt undeniable. The data supported it, and history seemed to support it as well. But markets have a way of testing certainty, and soon Dalio's certainty would be tested in public. For a time, Ray Dalio believed the market would soon confirm his analysis. The pressure in the global economy was real, interest rates were still high, and many economists expected growth to slow sharply. From Dalio's perspective, the conditions that often preceded economic downturns were already present. But markets do not move according to expectation alone. In August of 1982, something unexpected happened. Instead of collapsing, the stock market began to rise. At first, the move seemed small. Short rallies after difficult periods are not unusual, and many investors assumed the strength would fade quickly. But the rally did not fade. It accelerated. Confidence returned to the market faster than Dalio had anticipated. Investors began buying again, believing that the worst of the economic pressure had already passed. The same environment Dalio believed would trigger a depression was now being interpreted as the beginning of recovery. And the market continued climbing. Inside Dalio's fund, the consequences became visible quickly. Positions built for a downturn were now moving in the wrong direction, and losses began to accumulate. At first, the damage seemed manageable. But as the rally continued, the pressure intensified. Clients started asking questions. Some wanted reassurance, others wanted explanations. A few simply wanted their money back. From the outside, the conclusion looked obvious. Ray Dalio had been wrong. As the rally continued, the situation inside Dalio's firm became increasingly difficult. The positions he had built for a downturn were now producing steady losses, and what once looked like a carefully reasoned strategy was beginning to collapse under pressure. Clients were growing impatient. Some demanded explanations, while others simply withdrew their money. For a small investment firm, those withdrawals carried serious consequences. Capital was leaving the fund, and without capital, the strategy itself could not survive. Dalio was forced to make decisions he had never expected to face so early in his career. He began letting employees go. People he had hired with optimism now had to be told that the company could no longer afford to keep them. Within a short period of time, the office that had once felt full of ambition became quiet. Desks were empty. Conversations disappeared. The firm Ray Dalio had built was beginning to unravel. Financial pressure soon became personal pressure. At one point, Dalio had to borrow money from his father simply to continue operating. It was a moment few people on Wall Street ever discuss openly, the moment when conviction meets reality. And reality wins. After the losses, Ray Dalio faced a question that every investor eventually encounters. Not how much money had been lost, but why the decision had been wrong. For many people on Wall Street, failure is something to hide. Mistakes are explained away, forgotten, or quietly buried beneath the next opportunity. Dalio chose a different path. Instead of avoiding the experience, he began examining it in detail. He returned to the same data he had trusted before and reviewed the assumptions that had shaped his prediction, comparing them with the outcome the market had actually produced. Slowly, the lesson became clearer. The problem had not been the data itself. The problem had been certainty. Dalio had believed his interpretation of the system was correct. The models had supported his view, and the patterns he recognized seemed convincing, but the market had responded to forces he had not fully considered. Reality was more complex than the model. From that moment, Dalio began building a different way of thinking about decisions. He no longer wanted a system based on personal conviction. He wanted a process that forced every idea to be tested, questioned, and challenged before it became a position in the market. Mistakes would no longer be hidden. They would be studied. Over time, this approach became the foundation of the firm he rebuilt. Bridgewater Associates grew slowly at first, guided by principles designed to reduce the influence of ego and increase the influence of evidence. What had once been a painful failure gradually became a lesson shaping every decision that followed. Years later, Bridgewater would become the largest hedge fund in the world. But the philosophy that built it did not begin with success. It began with a mistake. My name is Edmund Hale. I do not record profits. I record behavior. What happened to Ray Dalio in 1982 was not unusual in financial markets. Predictions fail, models break, and certainty often proves fragile when confronted with reality. What made this moment different was what followed. Dalio did not treat the mistake as something to hide. He treated it as something to understand. Instead of protecting his reputation, he began questioning his own assumptions. Instead of defending the prediction, he examined the process that had produced it. In markets, that choice is rare. Most investors search for confirmation. They defend their views, repeat familiar arguments, and hope that time will eventually prove them right. Dalio chose something far more difficult. He built a system that forced him to confront his own mistakes. Over time, that discipline became the foundation of Bridgewater Associates. Years later, the firm would manage more money than any hedge fund in the world. But the foundation of that success was not confidence. It was humility. Markets have a way of teaching the same lesson again and again. Certainty is attractive and conviction is powerful, but when confidence replaces curiosity, mistakes become inevitable. The story of Ray Dalio is not a story about predicting the future. It is a story about what happens after the prediction fails. Because in markets, the most important decision is not always the first one. Sometimes it is the decision to learn from being wrong. And that decision, more than any trade, shapes everything that comes after.